Hello and welcome to a brand new video. Today we're going to delve into one of the most complex and debated doctrines in Christian theology, the Trinity. In this video we'll explore what the doctrine of the Trinity actually teaches, and just importantly, what it doesn't teach. We'll take a historical look of how the Church Fathers articulated the concept, and we'll engage it with some common philosophical and theological objections that have been raised over the centuries. And with that being said, let's begin. According to the doctrine, God is one divine being who exists as three distinct but co-eternal, consubstantial, and co-equal persons, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Each person is fully God, yet there's only one God. The Father is not the Son or the Holy Spirit, the Son is not the Father or Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is not the Father or the Son. They are three distinct persons who share the same divine nature. According to the Church Father and Saint Basil, quote, "In a brief statement, I shall say that the essence, ousia, is related to the person, hypostasis, as the general to the particular. Each one of us partakes of existence because he shares an ousia, while because of his individual properties he is A or B. So in the case in question, ousia refers to the general conception, like goodness, Godhead, or such notions, while hypostasis is observed in the special properties of fatherhood, sonship, and sanctifying power. If then they speak of persons without hypostasis, they are talking nonsense, ex hypostai. But if they admit that the person exists in a real hypostasis, as they do acknowledge, and let them so number them as to preserve the principles of homoousion in the unity of the Godhead, and proclaim their reverent acknowledgement of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and the complete perfect hypostasis of each person so named. The nature that the three persons of the Trinity share is ontological consubstantiation. This means that the persons of the Trinity possess all the attributes of God, such as the great omni properties. The three persons of the Trinity are all equal in power, glory, and will, even though some contemporary Christian analytic philosophers say that there's three wills rather than one. And the persons of the Trinity all share the same authority, and there's no hierarchy or subordination among them. According to the 5th century Church Father and Saint Cyril of Alexandria, he says, quote, "To attribute individual properties to each separate divine person is tantamount to saying that there's three separate and distinct gods," end quote. Or according to Gregory of Nyssa, he says, quote, "Since then the Holy Trinity fulfills every operation in a manner similar to that which I have spoken, not by separate action according to the number of persons, but so that there is one motion and one disposition of the good will, which is communicated from the Father through the Son to the Holy Spirit." This idea ties closely to what is known as the eminent Trinity and the economic Trinity. The former refers to who God is in himself, the eternal internal life of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, while the economic Trinity relates to how God acts in history and in creation. Although each divine person is distinct, they don't act independently. Their actions are united and inseparable, as emphasized by the Nicene theologians. The Son doesn't have a separate will from the Father, instead they have the same divine will. Saint Basil explains, or Basil if you want to pronounce it, explains that when Jesus speaks of doing the will of the Father or obeying his command, it's not because he's subordinate or lacks initiative, but it's supposed to emphasize their perfect unity. According to the doctrine of the Trinity, the Son is begotten by the Father from eternity past. This means the Son has always existed, it was not created at any point in time. The term begotten emphasizes the unique relationship between the Father and Son, which is different from the relationship between the Father and the Holy Spirit, or the Son and the Holy Spirit, which is spiration or procession, as the 4th century Church Father and Saint Gregory of Nazianzus says, quote, "The Holy Spirit is truly Spirit, coming forth from the Father, indeed, but not in the same manner of the Son, for it is not by generation, but by procession, since I must coin a word for the sake of clearness. The Son's personhood is grounded in the Father because the Son is begotten by the Father from eternity past, so therefore the Son's existence is dependent on the Father's begetting. However, that doesn't mean the Son is a created being or subordinate to the Father. The Son is fully God, equal in power and glory to the Father, but they share the same divine nature. Therefore, while the Son's personhood is grounded in the Father, he's still fully God and equal to him in every way." According to Hilary, the 4th century Church Father, in his work on the Trinity, quote, "The Father is greater than the Son, for manifestly he is greater who makes another to be all that he himself is, who imparts to the Son, by mystery of the birth, the image of his own unbegotten nature, who begets him from himself into his own form." One concept that further clarifies the relationship within the Trinity is perichoresis, a Greek term meaning mutual indwelling. This concept teaches that each person of the Trinity exists fully within the others. Church fathers like Hilary, which mentioned earlier, and John Damascus use this term to affirm that the three persons of the Trinity aren't parts, but fully God and entirely God. So Hilary says in that same book mentioned earlier on the Trinity, quote, "It seems impossible that one object should be both within and without another, or that since it is laid down that the beings of whom we are treating, even though they do not dwell apart, retain their separate existence and condition. These beings can reciprocally contain one another, so that one should permanently envelop and also be permanently enveloped by the other, whom yet he envelops." The Holy Spirit is also one of the three persons of the Trinity. According to Catholic belief, the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, and this is known as the filioque, or meaning from the Son in Latin. Or, on the other hand, the Orthodox Church believes that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father alone, and this is known as the monarchy of the Father. According to the Eastern Orthodox, the filioque would lead to an infinite regress of persons, while the Catholics argue, on the other hand, that if the other persons of the Trinity didn't have the ability to bring about another person, that would lead to subordinationism. So according to Thomas Aquinas, he explains that if we consider the power itself, then there is no distinction between the Father and the Son, since they are the same divine power. However, if we focus on the persons themselves as agents of spiration of the Holy Spirit, Aquinas asserts that the Holy Spirit proceeds from both the Father immediately and immediately through the Son. Aquinas also says that the Son doesn't receive numerically distinct power for spiration of the Holy Spirit from the Father, and said that the same spirit of power belongs to both the Father and the Son. So this implies that the Son isn't a secondary or incidental cause of the procession of the Holy Spirit. So therefore the Holy Spirit proceeds equally from both the Father and the Son, even though sometimes it's said that it's principally properly from the Father, because the Son receives his power from the Father. Either way, without beginning or spiring, there'd be no way to distinguish the persons prior to creation. So why did the Father eternally beget the Son? According to Athanasius, who was another 4th century church father, and his work against the Arians, that, quote, "Since then the Son is by nature and not by will, he is without pleasure of the Father and not by the Father's will. No, verily, the Son is with the pleasure of the Father, and as he says himself, quote, the Father loves the Son and shows him all things. As for not from the will did he begin to good, nor yet is good without will and pleasure. For what he is, that is also he is pleasure. Also that the Son should be, though it came not from will, yet it is not without his pleasure or against his purpose. For as his own subsistence is by his pleasure, also so the Son, being proper to his essence, is not without his pleasure." So basically, Athanasius is arguing that the Son's existence is not of the Father's will alone, but also by his nature and his love, in the same way that the Father's goodness is not a result of his will alone, but is inherent to his nature and being. According to Gregory of Nyssa, who is another 4th century church father and saint, in his work against Eunomius, he says, his primary focus is on the will of the Father and eternally begetting the Son. So he says, quote, "Neither does this immediate conjunction exclude the willing of the Father. In that sense, he had a Son without choice, by some necessity of his nature, nor does that willing separate the Son from the Father, coming in between them as a kind of interval, so that we neither reject from our doctrine the willing of the begetter directed to the Son, as being, so to say, a force out of the conjunction of the Son's oneness with the Father, nor do we by any means break the inseparable connection, when willing is regarded as involved in the generation." And if you want to throw in some Protestantism as well, John Calvin says in his Institutes of the Christian Religion that, quote, "Regarded as Son, he is of the Father, his essence is without beginning, while his person has its beginning in God the Father." And indeed, the Orthodox writers who in former times spoke of the Trinity only use this term with reference to the persons. So the begetting of the Son by the Father was not done involuntarily by his nature, although it is his nature, but his will. In other words, the Father necessarily causes the Son and the Holy Spirit in accordance with his will, but not an act of his will. But either way, if the Father causes the Son eternally by necessity, then the Father has no free will, and if it's his will alone, then the Son would be a contingent being, as the Father could have done otherwise. So now that we've laid out the Orthodox Trinitarian position, now let's turn to some major objections against the Trinity. and see how Christian theologians have responded to some of them. But before we begin, I want to give a quick heads up that if you're a Christian viewer, some of that what I might say may be challenging or uncomfortable to hear, and I understand if you feel like the urge to click off, and I fully respect that, but my goal isn't to offend, but to present a sincere critique in the spirit of honest dialogue. So one objection is related to the beginning of the Son and the spiration of the Holy Spirit, which is the doctrine of eternal processions, and it results in the Father alone being aseity. And aseity is, if you don't know, existence in and of oneself, as opposed to through another. And this is similar to the arguments that the Arians used against the Trinitarians prior to the Council of Nicaea. And that if the Son is caused by the Father, then he couldn't be equal to the Father, or the Son is dependent. And they would for you argue that if the Son is dependent upon the Father for his existence, then how could he be God? Furthermore, if the Son is dependent, then he couldn't be necessary, and then therefore he would be contingent. And also you could argue from another way that if the Son and Spirit lack the attribute of aseity and self-sufficiency, then they won't have the same essence as the Father. So the next objection is known as the problem of indexicals. An indexical is a linguistic expression whose reference can change based off the context. So an example of an indexical would be an I, he, she, like stuff like that. And if person A says I'm happy and person B says the same sentence that they're happy, then even though the sentence is the same, the content of the sentence is different because the reference is different. So in the doctrine of the Trinity, there's only one mind or one will in the Trinity, as we mentioned in the doctrine of perichoresis. So each thought of the persons are eternally known by the other, and no thought is independent or hidden from the other, and therefore each thought is known eternally and simultaneously. However, a problem arises pertaining to indexicals. The Father alone can know the proposition, I am the Father, while the Son alone knows the proposition and can affirm the proposition that I am the Son. So therefore the divine persons are aware of different propositions if they use a mental token with the indexical I. And to be aware of a proposition is to perform a mental act. So if there's an instance where the persons are aware of a different proposition, then they're performing a different mental act. So therefore they can't be the same. It can't be the case that the persons only have one shared mind. And other examples would include that the Father only can know that I am unbegotten, and the Son only knows that he is begotten of the Father, so they can't share that same. It wouldn't make sense for them to share the same mind based off that. So one third objection is known as the logical problem of the Trinity. It's basically that the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit are fully God, and they're not each other, yet there's only one God, but it seems to follow that there's three gods instead of one. So the argument centers around how the word I is being used. I mean, what does it mean when it says that the Son is God? So it can either be an is of identity or an is of predication. For example, when I say that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, it's an is of identity because Peter Parker and Spider-Man are the same person. However, when I say that Spider-Man is strong, I don't mean that Spider-Man is identical to strength, but strength is predicated of him. So when speaking of identity, if I say that the Son is God and the Father is God by classical identity, it would result in the Son being identical to the Father, which is the heresy of modalism. In response to this, Christian theologians try to argue that for the Trinity there must be a different counting system other than classical identity. But in response to this, I ask whether this new counting system could be used for anything else other than the Trinity, because it seems kind of ad hoc. Another proposed solution to the logical problem of the Trinity, besides rejecting classical identity, is social Trinitarianism. So basically, when I say that the Father is God or the Son is God, the is a predication, like I'm ascribing the property of divinity to them. And when I say that there's only one God, it's more of a title where God is equivalent to the Trinity. So according to this model, each person in the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, is understood in a robust psychological sense of personhood. And it's not just a mode or a mask, but actually centers of consciousness. That means that there's three minds, three wills, and three self-aware subjects, each who are fully divine, possessing the same divine nature. So it's like saying that Peter, James, and John all share a single human nature, will remain as three distinct persons. So too, the Father, Son, Holy Spirit are three distinct persons who share the same divine nature. So therefore, it's that there's still only one God, because there's only one divine essence. But I find that this model walks dangerously close to tritheism, and it pretty much is tritheism. that there's an existence of three gods. So to avoid this, social Trinitarians insist that the persons of the Trinity are not independent beings, but are mutually dependent and are in perfect harmony and always willing the same thing. And they argue that this unity of will is what preserves monotheism. But if you take a step back, if each of the persons has a distinct mind and will, then you have three individual substances or three divine souls that just kind of happen to get along really well. So if that's what counts as one God, then why not say there's a million perfect, harmonious gods? Then would that still be one God? At this point, it becomes too thin of a definition of monotheism. Another objection to social Trinitarianism is known as the left-out dilemma. So is the Trinity a fourth instance of the divine nature, or is it not? If it is, then there are four gods. This is because if what makes them divine is the divine nature that they share, then you have a Trinity as the fourth instance of the divine nature, and that would mean that there are four gods, and that's unorthodox on the basis of monotheism. If the Trinity is not an instance of the divine nature, and then the Trinity is not divine, and that abandons Trinitarian monotheism. If the Trinity is divine, but not a fourth instance of the divine nature, then that either gives two options. Either there are two ways to be divine, or there's only one way to be divine. If there's only one way to be divine, then again there are two options. Only the persons that make up the Trinity are properly divine, or only the Trinity as a whole is divine and not the persons. But is it fair to say that the only Trinity and not the persons are divine? Because that conflicts with the premise that the Son and the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are divine. If the persons are divine and the Trinity is not divine, then that also abandons Trinitarian monotheism again. That leaves with only one option. There's two ways to be divine differently between the Trinity and the persons, and that's unorthodox as well, as that leads to the persons being less divine than the Trinity is, as that would make the persons as three parts of God, making a whole part relationship, which contradicts the divine simplicity, which states that God is indivisible, and this also leads to subordinationalism, as the persons of the Trinity are subordinate to the Trinity as a whole. But at the end of the day, the official position of the Catholic Church regarding the explanation of the Trinity is that it's a mystery. And that brings us to the end of this video, so thank you for watching. The doctrine of the Trinity has been shaped over centuries by councils, theologians, and creeds, and continues to ask questions from us today, theological questions. And whether you're a believer or a skeptic or just curious, I hope this video helped clarify what Trinitarians actually mean in their positions when they say that they speak of one person or one being of God in three persons. And if that doesn't make sense to you or anything I said may be confusing, please leave a comment below and I'll try to answer it to the best of my ability. And don't forget to like and subscribe as always.